First speaker this morning is R.A. Judy, who is professor of English at the University of Pittsburgh. His title is On Community Love. Professor Judy is the author of Disforming the American Canon, African Arabic Slave Narrative and the Vernacular, which was published at the University of Minnesota Press in 1993, and won a nomination for the 1997 Gustav Arlett Award in the Humanities. Ronald has been a member of the Pitt faculty since 1991. He came here as professor of critical and cultural studies in the Department of English. He's held, like all of the rest of our colleagues here, a number of important visiting positions, among them visiting professor at Brown, visiting Fulbright professor of ethnic and minority American literature at the Bourguiba Institute for Living Languages at the University of Tunis I. He's also been a long-time member of the B2 editorial collective, if my memory is correct, since 1993. He took his PhD at the University of Minnesota, where he studied with Vlad Godzic, having previously done undergraduate studies in Cairo in Arabic language and literature at Al-Azhar University. So as a comparatist fluent in Arabic and with a specialist's knowledge of North Africa, he has contributed especially to B2 a remarkably successful, widely distributed, often cited dossier on what some have called the Arab Spring, focusing on the Tunisian Revolution. This dossier appeared in 2012 and is a project which he continues for B2 in translation and gathering of other materials, and which has led him recently to major lectures on the subjects in places such as Columbia, Cambridge, and other distinguished universities. Among his many honors are fellowships from the Fulbright, the Ford, the Mellon, the Hewlett Foundations, as well as, and here I'm especially proud to acknowledge this honor, having won a second place from the Council of Editors of Learned Journals for the special issue of Boundary 2 that he did for us on the work of W.E.B. Du Bois. He has several books in progress right now on Fanon, on Islamia as a radical humanism. With Tony Bogues, he is proposing a special issue of Boundary 2 on Black radicalism. And right now he's writing a manuscript called In Memoria of Imagination. This talk today stands in relation to several of these projects, and I ask you to welcome Ronald.
Good morning. I'm glad that Paul remembered yesterday's date. Eric was a very, very, very dear friend of mine from before I was at Pitt, while still at CMU. For a while, he, I, and Kea Bungale constituted a kind of wild trio. I'll leave to your imaginations what he did that was wild. So I want to dedicate today's talk to my dear friend Eric, who is always on mind and indeed missed. What I'm going to give you today is a segment from a book manuscript that I am currently finishing, hope to have done by January, called Thinking in Disorder for Fordham Press. The title that I gave, Community of Love, I'm going to back into in a backward sort of way, because what I want to take up is a presentation that I gave at UCLA for Boundary 2, our first conference on poetics, and a kind of argument that took place in that presentation. For that, I apologize to Paul, who will have heard some of this, but of course it is an elaboration on that, and insofar as he was my principal interlocutor in the argument, he should well hear it again. Having said that, I want to frame this talk in a very particular way, and that is by marking a distinction between the anagogue, which Paul both spoke on and performed quite eloquently and powerfully in his talk at UCLA last spring on Stevens, and which was also on display for us in yesterday's quite masterful two presentations. And I want to contrast it with what I'm going to call very loosely al-Umma al-Sha'riya, the aesthetic community, and a different attitude towards poetry that we learned at Al-Azhar, which is recitation, and the way in which poetic recitation constitutes a certain kind of affective order. Now, having said that, I'm going to curse technology for having betrayed me for a minute, because the talk that I wanted to give is truncated. I want to return to a very specific topic. Oh, I'm really going to have to be extemporaneous because it won't come up. A very specific topic that I discussed in last spring's conversation, and that is James Baldwin's epigraph to another country, and that was the epigraph of Easy Rider, which involved a very specific citation of the Yellow Dog Blues. Now, that citation, and this is really going to make me be very quick in my talk because all of that's disappeared. So I can't recite the poem to you that I wanted to recite, which is a very important handy poem called the Yellow Dog Blues. And for whatever reason, even though I have it in my files, it won't come up. So I will have to try and summarize from memory. This is quite a test. The Yellow Dog Blues passage concerns a very specific moment in Nabil Ferez's novel, The Passenger of the West, in which Nabil Ferez recognizes in Baldwin's story about Rufus Thomas a very specific critique of the social religious discourse of sacrifice and religion as the foundation of human sociality. Specifically, he recognizes how Rufus Thomas is not a sacrifice. And Baldwin elaborates, in fact, that the foundation of American civilization, apropos of the question of erotic desire around Easy Rider, is not at all about a society founded in the sacrifice of crucifixion, but rather in murder, the murder of the black man. Now, my point in all of that is to remark the extent to which Baldwin's taking up the question of Rufus's death and Ferez celebrating it around a very specific remark that Baldwin says, and that is, "They have killed all of my friends," which Ferez turns into a poetic refrain over and over throughout the text, picking up the lyrical elements of Yellow Dog Blues, does not at all follow the current conversations we have about the problematics of sacrifice. And indeed, the expected terrain would be the terrain of Agamemnon's Homo Sacra. And all I would say about that expected terrain is that it does not at all, I think, adequately, in its reading of Robertson, Smith, and Durkheim's notions of sacrifice, give us any understanding of what's at stake conceptually in the conversation between Ferez and Baldwin about Baldwin's refusal, both of the discourse of sacrifice and the discourse of mimicry. Indeed, when Baldwin says, "And they have killed all my friends," stopping short on his lips, it becomes for Ferez an incantation. "It moved me," Ferez writes. He recounts. "It stunned me, shook me, filled me with an indescribable pain, as if suddenly I saw again Amura." That was his name. C'est son nom. Dying before the door of the Wurgi, where we lived, in the forest, during that fucking Algerian war. Amoura, that was his name. C'était son nom. In the 17th Battalion of the Algerian army, the #1 army in the world, and whom I loved. Amoura, who was someone who shaved before going to set bungal or booby traps along the Northeast line, saying, that way they cannot say we were Falagas. Amoura, with shaven face, splattered by a B-26. What a crop. And that donkey that continued grazing uncomprehendingly around his face, they have killed all my friends. The only ones I had, and no longer have, all technocrats, spectators, decorated with artificial ranks, travelers on a mission. But what the hell are they doing, and why is it so barren? They have killed all my friends. With this incantation that evokes friends killed, Ferris sees Rufus Scott, the Easy Rider. And in calling him this, Ferris is taking what Baldwin's presenting Rufus not as victim, but complicit in his pathology, pitching towards the river, crying, why, why? This is what comes from an old man trying to catch up with the digital technology. Now, I want to be clear on what is at stake in all this. Coming back to Paris in 1970, Baldwin was expressly refusing to be a sacrifice, to be killed as a totemic figure, and his refusal presumes a different conception of sociality, a different way of ordering and thinking things. That is the gift of the blues love Easy Rider gives. Referring to Rufus Scott's corpse in response to Ferris telling him the book leaves the impression that the evolution of American society is completely conditioned by the negation of the black man. Baldwin states, it is the reason Rufus kills himself so early in the book. I wanted to find a way to make the reader reflect. Rufus's cadaver, that's the black cadaver in the American conscience. All of American society has been built in order to kill, not to deny the black man or humiliate him, but to kill him. That's the key to the American drama. This is an expression of a trap of a certain black beauty, exemplified in Rufus Scott's inability to live in another country. Rufus's insouciance is elemental to his suicide being a murder that is not sacrificial. He is no totem, sacramental or otherwise, nor is he a scapegoat. His willful disavowal of his sexuality in rebuffing Eric, and his rage as part of the pathology of murder that is American society, cannot be addressed in terms of his emasculation at the hands of the white world. His cruelty and abuse of Leona is symptomatic of the patriarchal conceptualization of the origins of society. In insisting that the death of Rufus Scott is the death of the black man in America, a death upon which all of American society is built, and portraying Scott as a robust participant in that death, Baldwin shows that there must be another way out, one that eschews the premise of man underlying the proposition of emasculation and slavery, and its underlying postulation of heteronormative society. What Du Bois called the empty abstraction based on the epistemic fallacy of confounding of things with thoughts of things. There can be no redemption of man, but rather the expression of other genre of humans, another species, to borrow a line of thinking from Frantz Fanon. There is something fundamentally androgynous about Rufus, and so too about the Negro. Baldwin recognizes that Ferris gets this, and in a way that few others did. Now, again, this moment of recognition, which I really regret that I wasn't able, is really a beautifully written passage in which Baldwin, encountering Bobby Kennedy's remark that he too could become president, goes on to explain why the Negro does not need to mimic at all the white men, both in terms of the failure of the Enlightenment project to produce an ethical subject worthy of mimicry, but also in rejection of the notion of mimicry as the basis of social organization. And this discussion of mimicry is at the heart of the exchange between Ferris and Baldwin, because Ferris recognizes, and here he misattributes to Baldwin a remark from Abbe Memmi, in which Memmi, in his introduction to The Fire Next Time, says that America is a nation of mestissage, métis. And Ferris wants that to be Baldwin's statement, which it isn't. It's Mimi's. And Mimi makes this statement on the false assumption that the Negro is nothing but a mimic of the white, which of course is Mimi's long critique not only of Baldwin but also of Frantz Fanon, that blackness is sort of an empty signifier. And this is Mimi's way of critiquing Fanon's revolutionary tendency. And what Ferris recognizes in conversation with Baldwin is that at issue in this mimicry is a different way of being, right? That there's a different way of thinking about mimicry. And indeed, there are many other ways to think on mimicry. Here's one that I want to offer from the Book of Eloquence by Abu Uthman Amr ibn Bakr al-Qanani al-Basri, more widely known as al-Jahl, the bug-eye, remarking how it is possible to tell a person's ethnicity by accent, tells of a locksmith raised among the Arabs in the streets of Kufa who spoke excellent idiomatic Arabic. But whoever listens to him will know by how he articulates his sounds that he is of Tibetan origin. This goes to the frame about recitation that I've begun with. When we study Arud and we study the impact of poetry, we study Arud as precisely the materiality of sounds and silences, rhythm. And that, as Ibn Sina says, it is the materiality of the sound and the rhythm that excites the mind into what the Arabs call tahyil, the imaginative faculty of thinking. And that generates images, and those images become the way in which the masses of people have access to truth and reality. And hence those images belong, for the Arabs, within the purview of structures of knowledge and social organization. So mimicry is of paramount importance. Recitation is of paramount importance. It is the sound that matters. And so indeed, the majority of Muslims who hear Alif Lam Mim Hadha al-Kitabu La Rayba Fi Hudan lil-Muttaqin, very simple Sajid poetry, can be brought to tears without having any sense of what the Jahid called the meaning and mind of the love, that the expression constitutes an affective order, and hence a social order, on the basis of affectivity. So he's remarking about a person who could speak eloquently or excellently with idiomatic Arabic, but whenever you listen to him, by the way he articulates his sounds, you can tell that he was Nabataean in origin. And the same would hold true if it were a Khorasani speaking. Khorasan is a Central Asian population at the time. Yet al-Jahid points out, in the time being the 10th century, that there is the occasional mimic who assimilates the native accent of the Yemeni, as well as the Khorasani, or the Awazi, or the Zinji, or the Sindhi, or the Habashi, different ethnic peoples. And more besides, with such precision, you'd think he was one of those origins. The same mimic assimilates, this is his term, stuttering to the point of epitomizing the condition, or blindness so well he captures every facial expression and body movement of every blind person you've ever seen. Al-Jahid is talking about the sort of professional mimic, or al-hakiya, an archaic term that he uses, who practice the art of mimicry and mimicking animal sounds and sundry Arabic ethnic accents at the imperial court and in the salons of the urban elite, as well as at the markets and the gates of the city. He's talking about, or rather his talking about that sort of performance, the way he does, underscores the adequacy of rendering this term in English, al-hakiya, as mimic, with its etymological relation to mimos, the mimes of Greco-Roman antiquity, those popular farcical depictions of scenes from everyday life of common people that were enacted in the marketplace for the benefit of the mob and in the courts of the aristocracy well into late antiquity and throughout the Greco-Roman Empire, including the Byzantine province of Palestine, which means that the ancestors of al-Jahid's Nabataean were undoubtedly well acquainted with it. Should we seriously consider Irfan Shahid's philological speculations? Those Nabataeans were genitors of the Arabic term memos, another anachronistic term. In fact, indeed, now very, very archaic term for actor, that is supposed to be an Arabization of mimes. Because the Greco-Roman mimes were more concerned with mimicry of character, unlike tragedy or high drama, which was concerned with action, they usually mimicked the accents and vernacular of the common people or foreigners. John Ackthorne Nairn once surmised, as he expanded his energies poring over the mimes of Herodes, that in their earliest forms, these mimes tended toward buffoonery, mimicking animal sounds and sounds of nature. He surmised this from a passage in Book 3 of Plato's Republic that we're all very familiar with. And if we follow suit and look there, however, we find that when Socrates asked Admeantus whether the elite guardians of the Republic ought to be good mimes, mimeticos, his concern is with their proper education. His concern is pedagogical. And this concern with mimicry's pedagogical function has to do with poetic style, in the sense that all mythology and poetry is a narration, diegesis, of what is, as Aristotle does, past or passing, or to come, which may be either simple or pure narration, or imitation, or a combination of both. Now, of course, we know that the example Socrates gives of the latter is the Iliad, citing the first lines of which the poet Homer is himself the speaker, but then narrating Ceres' direct speech assimilates his style of speaking and bodily bearing, assuming his character, which is the very definition of mimicry. But for Socrates, the question of mimicry is not only about the model being mimicked, but also the poetic style with which the model is represented. If poetry is at all salutary for the guardians, then there is a proper form of it. The conjunction of the question of mimicry and poetic style has to do with Plato's understanding that continuous imitation influences the character of the imitator, and that mimicry means changing one's psyche, at least for the moment, assimilating it to the character of the model. Now, bear with me. I'm going to explain a bit more what we already know, but to mark not only the historical basis for the rightness of rendering el-harakia as mimic, but also to mark, so you'll understand later on, why El-Jahat says it's precisely this notion that the Greeks have of poetry that makes them an inferior society, an inferior poetic people, that they have no poetry at all because of the way in which mimicry is bound up with learning, what Jahat will call the learning of the world, in contrast to the Arabic poetry, which is spontaneous, which presents the images of experience unmediated and immediately, and hence moves the heart and the mind to constitute the dynamic community. As Socrates says, when a just and good man in the course of a narration comes on some saying or action of another good man, he will like to personate him and will be most ready to play the part of the good man when he is acting firmly and wisely. This is why the guardians must not imitate women, slaves, men of low character or conduct, the Gnostic persons, or the voices of animals, except, he says, of course, in jest. Equally important, they must engage in mimicry of a singular kind, that of the good and just, and employ a style of narration closer to Homer's, with a greater proportion of simple narration than outright mimicry, in a style that is of regular, suitable pitch and rhythm. In contrast is the sort of character who will zealously imitate anything, not as a joke, but in earnest, and so employ a wide variety of rhythms and pitches. Plato, of course, was not a great fan of polyrhythmic. Such a virtuosity of mimicry, one who can bark like a dog, bleat like a sheep, or crow like a cock, and whose entire art consists in mimicry of voice and gesture, with extremely little narration, is to be feted and then escorted out of the Republic, which prefers for psychic health the monorhythmic. The more austere poet or storyteller who imitates the style of virtue, of the virtuous owner. Plato presents it, the association of psychic health and monorhythm, or more exactly, the contrast between the versatile virtuoso man and the guardian who mimics only noble characters in a single style that foregrounds the authoritative voice of narration. He presents it as all about the unsuitability of mixture or admixture in the Calliopolis, or Callipolis. Adimantus chooses the unmixed imitative over the mixed, which is, as Socrates notes, contrary to what is far more pleasing to boys and their tutors and the great mobs. And he does so because he subscribes to the old man's notion that there is no twofold or manifold man among the citizens of the city, where every man serves a single specialized function according to the tripartite organization of life practice into those who rule, those who are the guardians or auxiliaries, and those who are the producers of material things. This political order of life reflects the tripartite human psyche consisting of reason, as we know most, elan, themos, and desire, with a proportional distribution of the psychic elements determining the individual's political function in the beautiful city. Keeping to the noble lie, it is the work of philosophy expressed in the single narrative style of reason to which proper mimicry is subjugated, the paradigmatic instance of which is the Platonic dialogue, to achieve harmony between the order of political life and the tripartite human psyche. What Plato's Republic provides is what some regard as the earliest instance of a philosophical literary theory, according to which there is an isomorphic relationship between poetic style and lifestyle in service of the polity. Following as it does the section at the end of Book 2, in which Socrates criticized Hesiod's and Homer's anthropomorphic representation of the gods, this distinction of narrative style is a marker of the turn from mythology to philosophy we come to call, after Shelley, the Greek miracle. Now, having considered this conceptual history in support of the adequacy of mimic as a translation of the Arabic al-hakiya that al-Jahath uses, I'll note in passing quickly that the verb haka, from which this term derives, has a very expansive range of meaning, designating the activity of narrating or telling a tale, as well as those of imitating and assimilating something. And it means this, and these actions simultaneously, idiomatically, across a variety of contemporary vernaculars, giving us the common cognate, hikayat, tale, or narrative account. Point of fact, in his telling of the virtuoso mimic, al-Jahath states, al-hakiya min al-nas, yahki al-faz sukan al-yaman, simulates the expressions of the population of men. Whereas the classical Greek philosophical tradition introduces a distinct narrative style of reason, of pure diegesis, that is favorably contrasted to all other styles of narration and mimesis for its demonstrative function. The authority of al-hakiya stems from the very things Plato found objectionable, and that is the realistic representation of quotidian material circumstances and existence. Let us return then to how al-Jahath thinks mimicry and recall the tale he tells about a mullah. This word is not quite translatable because it indexes a complex set of conventional social relations that the customary rendering client with its sense of transactional contract does not adequately capture. And this has a lot to do, and I won't have time to go into the reasons for this, I'll just tell you right now. This term mullah becomes the etymological basis of mulatto in North African Arabic, which is what gives us the Spanish mulatto. And it refers to a relationship of power in which non-Arabic speakers become Arabophone and are legitimated in terms of their tribal affiliations. So it has, in al-Jahath's usage at the time, very much a symbolic meaning of the order of transculturation with an implicit biological element as well, although not necessarily so. So, for example, the founder of contemporary Arabic fiction and prose, Ibn Muqaffa, which al-Jahath elaborates, was a Persian mullah, biologically Persian, if we can speak loosely in those terms, which in a minute you'll see I trouble. But culturally was completely Arabic in association with certain urban tribal orders, specifically the Abbasid imperial court. Anyhow, there was a mullah of the Ziyad named Abu Dhabuba al-Zenji. This is a particular term. Zenji refers to a specific population on the east coast of Africa in the area of Somalia. And in contemporary Arabic, it becomes the equivalent of our term Negro. But at the time that Al-Jahd is writing, it means specifically those people. So for example, the word I used earlier, Al-Ahbash, were the Ethiopians. And the Sindhi were also recognized as being a black-skinned people, as were the Khorasani from Central Asia. So it doesn't have a racial connotation in terms of color, as it does geographical location. And Al-Jahd himself was of Ethiopian and Arabic descent. And so himself. So there was a mullah of the Ziyad named Abu Dabuba al-Zanji, who would stand at the Al-Kharq gate in Baghdad near the mule skinner's corral and bray with such effect that every donkey, however old, sick, lame, tired, or broken down, would bray with him in a way that none of them would have if any one of their kind really had brayed. He had managed to combine all aspects of a jackass, braying into one bray. Something he did also with dog barks, thereby confirming the ancients' postulate that mankind can be regarded as a microcosm of the world. Now we know that for the ancients of Jack's references, Democritus and Xenophon and the Pythagoreans, Heraclitus, the Stoics, and the Neoplatons, the issue was accounting for the relation of the one to the many, or the particular to the universal. Once again, we find ourselves drawn to Plato's preoccupation with psychic health. And as before, the issue is the affinity between the psyche of the world and the psyche of man, achieved in the philosophical style. Achieving the harmonics of these elements through logos and phronesis was the thrust of the well-rehearsed Delphonic inscription, "Know thyself," which is true virtue and of the ultimate reality, something Plato repeatedly reports Socrates swore by the dog to in the Apology and in Gorgias and in the Republic. Now, Abdul Fattah Khalito has recently instructed us in how important barking dogs are to Al-Jah's thinking about language and human identity. Recounting Al-Jah's story about how a lost veteran finds his way home by barking like a dog on the assumption that any responding creature will be attached to a human encampment. I'm assuming you all know that wonderful story of the fact Khalito tells, which is Al-Jah's, where the veteran's lost and he figures he'll find his way by barking as a dog because dogs are going to be attached to some human encampment. So if he follows the dog bark, he will find human beings. And he follows the dog barks and he comes upon human beings, but now the problem is whether or not they're his human beings, and whether they will recognize him as a human being because he's barking in fact like a dog. Now, Khalito has pointed out that mimicry of this sort reveals what the person is not. That is, the person's inauthenticity. As he puts it, the mimic wants to assimilate, to be like them, and yet in the end, he only marks a separation because by definition, he repeats what he is not. And like or almost is not an identity. Mimicry is based on an internal presence, he continues, and an external appearance. Whatever the completeness of the mimicry, it can never erase the difference. The issue for Khalito is language, more precisely bilingualism. And even more to the point, the correlation between style of expression and freedom or constraining of movement, one's place in the order of things. This amounts to a semiotics of mimicry. Here I have in mind recent work out of the Tartous School of Semiotics on the semiotics of resemblance put forward by Timo Maran and Esther Vos. And from that perspective, I share Khalito's sense that mimicry turns on difference, well, more precisely on differentiation, but do not concur with its being based on the difference between internal presence, and we know he means by this self-consciousness and external appearance. Not to suggest that mimicry is not about the masquerade, the assuming of some public persona, but rather that the activity of mimicry puts on display in a very sharp and pronounced way the conceit of authenticity. It shows off the motivationality of signifying practices, that a sign signifies only in being interpreted, as Charles Sanders Peirce put it. Or as he also put it, a sign is something that stands to somebody for something in some respect, giving us his tripartite theory of the basic sign structure as entailing a sign or signifier, an object or signified, and an interpretant, which is the understanding that we have of the sign-object relation, In other words, the meaning of a sign, such as a bark, is manifest in the interpretation it generates in sign users. In the instance of the anecdote that I just gave you, the sign users were somehow readily identifiable as human. And so social subjects within the same species. Again, in Polito's recounting of the Lost Bedouin story, they are heterospecies. The idea is, and here I am following Savannah's analysis of Peirce, that the interpretant, as some understanding of the relation between sign and object, gives a translation of the sign. As such, the generated interpretant functions as a further sign in an infinite process of semioses or representations, which Peirce postulated were generated in three possible ways: icons, or likenesses, where a sign stands for an object in virtue of some perceived shared quality; indices, in which the relation of sign to object is one of correspondence in fact; and symbols, where the relation is an imputed character, some observed general or conventional connection between sign and object. The element in this Peircean trichotomy that pertains to my concern with mimicry is iconicity, with which regard to the relationship between a representation, a sign, and its object, is the idea of that which is such as it is regardless of anything else. To explain how it is pertinent, let me start where Peirce starts his consideration of the relationship, which is from what he calls the iconic grounds, identifying grounds with abstraction, giving an example, the blackness of two black things. This is analogous to Saussure's sense of form, that is, the function of the iconicity of the sign is to pick out the relevant elements of expression and content. We can say then that according to Peirce, two items share an iconic ground to the extent that there are properties that each possess independently of the other, and which may be perceived or more broadly expressed as being identical or similar. Sticking with Peirce's own example, the blackness of a blackbird can be considered an iconicity. That is, when we compare two black things, we establish an iconic ground. Given that the iconic ground is based on the determination of properties the two items possess only because of being what they are, the standard of comparison must be something like similarity or identity. An icon, Peirce asserts, is a sign which stands for something merely because it resembles it, or partakes in the characters of the object. What we have here is a rudimentary theory of the semiotics of resemblance, and one whose concept of the basic structure of semiosis will find resonance in the earliest study of mimicry in biology, beginning with Henry Walter Bates' work on butterflies in 1862, as the study of superficial resemblance of organisms as a function of natural selection. In Bates' definition of biological mimicry, all subsequent theories that derive or dispute his definition, from Fitzmuir's to Moynihan, the basic sign structure follows Peirce's trichotomy. So that the mimic organism, called the model, functions as the object, the mimicking organism, called the mimic, as the sign, and the predatory organism, called the selecting agent, as the interpretant. Even with those theorists who dispute Bates' definition, because it combines selectivity with deception, in other words, resemblance of conspecific groupings combined with resemblance across heterospecific ones. Either converge model and mimic, or remove the selecting agent, or rather displace the motivation for mimicry onto the speciation as selection, and in so doing, still struggle with the semiotics of resemblance. Sir Edward Poulton's introduction of the category of epistemic mimicry to account for the functionality of coloration or markings to help animals recognize other individuals of the same species in his The Colors of Animals, makes this point rather neatly. In which case, mimicry is not exclusively about deception or camouflage, as Jacques Lacan, and after him Homi Bhabha, would have it, but is an activity of aesthetic representation, mimesis, which is perhaps why Roger Calvat was so preoccupied with biological mimicry, conceiving of the human activity of mimesis as on a continuum with the epistematic mimicry, delineating his three functions of mimicry as disguise, from which, of course, René Girard builds his mimetic theory. Plainly put, mimesis mimicry as a species activity, what Girard calls harmonization, referring to the 1,000-year-long passage from animality to humanity. The thing is that each of these theorizings and conceptualizations, in each of them, the species activity at play is most assuredly mimesis, representing, or representation, Peirce calls it, with Aristotle expressly in mind. Grounded in differentiation, or in more Peircean terms, iconicity is the first order relationship of sign and object, as the cognitive scientist Terence Deacon has proposed, based on his reading of Peirce. Iconicity is recognition, that is, the identification of a category and even stimulus generalization. To draw all this back to the opening remarks about the jahaz, Mula, who's a mimic, and properly explain its pertinence, I should elaborate a bit on what I've just said about mimesis in relation to mimicry. Before doing so, I want to mark here that Colito's anxiety about mimicry, necessarily exposing inauthenticity, is an anxiety about its exposing the working of translation as a constitution or a constitutive aspect of self-awareness. The issue at stake in all dominant theories of mimicry and their associated controversies is differentiation and resemblance. Simply put, on the assumption that mimicry, even when it is not camouflage, partakes of iconicity in the sense that the properties of resemblance are displayed. And in both the case of my anecdote about the Mula and Colito's about the Bedouin, these are vocal, is an affective problematic when it is undetected. That is to say, when it is not known as anything but the iconic. Getting back to speaking of dogs and the severely reduced status of the mimic in the Republic, where the guardians are to bark like dogs, only in jest. Here is one from the book of The Living by Al-Jari. Abu Miriam tells of a man, a merchant, in Medina, who had so much debt that he had to hide in his house from his creditors. Now one of them came to his place one day, and after some cajoling was allowed in to see him. And he says to him, "What would you do for me if I could show you a ruse that," and this is the important point, "will get you out of the mess you're in now and free you of all your creditors?" To which he replied, "I pay you what I owe you and whatever else you wanted from my possessions." Having gotten the man's oath, the debtor's oath on that, the creditor told him, "Before prayer tomorrow, have your servants sweep your door, wash your patio, put your shop in tip-top order, setting up a comfortable place for you to recline out front. After this, you sit down and wait for people to pass. And each time someone says hello to you, bark in his face. Make sure you bark indiscriminately at everyone who talks to you, even your relatives and servants, or creditors, or anyone else, until your behavior comes to the attention of the magistrate, in which case, bark at him too, and continue to do so no matter who addresses you. Once the prefect has made certain that you are not faking, no doubt he will declare you mentally incompetent and exonerate you of all your responsibilities." So our debtor did as instructed, and when some of his neighbors greeted him in the passing the next morning, he barked in their faces, and when others passed by, he did the same until his creditors got wind of his behavior and came on to see for themselves. Of course, he barked at them when they greeted him, and continued at it, which so vexed them, they seized him and took him to the magistrate, where he continued to bark in response to the latter's interrogation. This prompted them to take him before the judge, at whom he barked as well. The judge sentenced him to a few days in jail under close observation, during which time he persisted only in barking, at which point the judge ordered his release from jail to house arrest, again under strict observation. When he continued to bark even then, the judge determined that he was mentally incompetent and exonerated him for all responsibilities whatsoever. At the end of all of this, the creditor who had instructed the indebted merchant in the ruse came to him, demanding his due payment. And when he spoke to him, the merchant only barked. To which the creditor said, "Hold on, friend, you bark at me too, and I'm the one who taught you the ruse." To which our man replied with more barking, thereby freeing himself from all his creditors without paying a cent. A tale in jest. The mimicry is so good, not even the inventor of the fraud can tell if it's real or not. The ruse is predicated on the assumption that the capacity of deliberative reason is the basis for social responsibility as virtue, and that animals, specifically dogs, lack this capacity, and that consistent demonstrated performance as a dog, mimicry, is symptomatic of a cognitive dysfunction, specifically of a pathology, a fantasia aesthesis, or sensory imagining, causing a human animal to behave as a non-human animal, and so cannot be held responsible. The ability to distinguish between fraudulent and virtuous behavior turns on the capacity of deliberative reason to differentiate between particular things, and then again, in the abstract, on the basis of what they are essentially, which is determined by what they must do in the world, and then to gather those particular resemblances together into a collection. In other words, the work of phronesis is collection and division, both generic classification and speciation. Here, in El-Jah's anecdote, the genus is animals, which includes the species Homo sapiens, whose determinate activities are language and deliberative reasoning. Yet, if those are the determinants of belonging to the species, then what is an animal that looks like a human being, but barks like a dog so incessantly, there is good reason to infer the absence of reason. The problematic is deepened by the fact that this individual behaves in every other way one would expect a reasonable member of society to behave. He wears clothing, lives in a house, and responds to community action from other human beings, albeit by barking, but is responsive nonetheless, just as a dog would be. And there's the rub, because a dog too is responsive to human beings talking at it. So much so we are inclined to imagine, if not outright construe, that there is a cross-species communicative transaction occurring. Which raises another set of questions about just how far we can rely on the theory of reason-based communicative activity as a determinant of the species. The joke's purview extends when we keep in mind that the principal purveyor of the theory gives us philosophical dogs. Now, I'm not going to recount what I'm imagining all of you know, and that's Plato's story about the philosophical dog. Right? The gist of which is that when a dog sees a stranger, Socrates says, it's fierce, although it never had any bad experience of it. When it sees someone it knows, it greets him warmly, even if it never had a good experience with him. Socrates states further that the dog, then, is a true philosopher, because it distinguishes friend from foe, only by the criterion of knowing and not knowing. And the dog is philosophical precisely because it defines what is its own and what is alien by knowledge and ignorance, making it a lover of learning, he says. Knowledge in this context is identified with learning, which is why Socrates says that your dog now is your only philosopher. Its capacity to distinguish the unknown from the known is merely the consequence of its having learned where it belongs in the pack. With this, and knowing what a dog does when confronted with the stranger in its territory, it barks incessantly and fiercely. We are brought back to the issue of the guardians needing to be amenable to learning. But whereas mimicking a dog barking cannot be done seriously, being like a dog that barks in ignorance is required. T.A. Sinclair, of course, once remarked that the philosophical dog argument was the sort of thing that Plato's enemies loved to point at and wanted to show how silly he was. And his friends, such as the classicist Jaeger, who knew him far better than Sinclair, says quite rightly that we must not take Plato's little jokes seriously. Sinclair then asks, but what is the point of the joke? If this is just another instance of the Socratic habit of homely comparisons, there is no joke, and we have to hand the passage back to Plato's foes. Sinclair's fix was, of course, to suggest that it is really no more than a rather tentative suggestion offered to preserve some dignity, that it is a parody of the nature of the school of sophists. He offers no significant textual evidence in support of this. Others, more conservative minds, that generally want to take the Republic very seriously, like Alan Bloom and Leo Strauss, dismiss it outright as not serious. As El-Jahad well knew, a knowledge artfully and eloquently displayed in his performance and style, jokes are serious, often exhibiting the fundamentals of thinking, and so the basis for an order of knowledge. The keen attention he pays to translations of Greek into Arabic, holding Plato in particularly high esteem, permits speculation that he was familiar with Hunan ibn Ishaq's translation of the first three books of Galen's synopsis of the Platonic dialogues that included the Republic. Yet in El-Jah's jocular handling of dogs and knowledge in the Book of the Living, it's Aristotle, the master of logic, he calls it, who is expressly called out for his theory of hybridization as speciation, proclaiming there are in nature a variety of species hybrids among wild animals, such as the Seleucid dog generated from the fox, copulating with the dog bitch, and the Indian hound, which is generated from the animal the Greeks called tagrish, copulating with the dog bitch. Whether or not Aristotle, and of course you remember that Pliny the senior, the elder, quotes Aristotle on this when he says something new always out of Africa. Because Aristotle, when he said this, was talking about the fact that Africa is the place of perpetual hybridization. Whether or not Aristotle consistently held in accordance with this hylomorphic functionalism that species were immutable, the passage from the generations of animal al-Jahid references offers a theory of hybridization as speciation, which is in concert with his own views. In fact, when reading The Book of the Living, we are immersed in tales of mongrels and mutts, of mullahs, of mulattoes. Continuing our earlier discussion of the mongrel and cross-fertilization of different species, al-Jahid tells us at one point, it is postulated that an Issabar is the offspring of the hyena from a wolf. This is likely referring to the crocutia, more generally known as the Latin hyena. Another possibility is the le crocator, Leo crocota, in Borges' Fantastic Bestiary, the book of imaginary beings. This concern with species differentiation and crossbreeding is not constrained to dogs or to canines, but turns on al-Jahid's understanding all zoological life as being fundamentally transmutational, we would say evolutionary. The dispute then is not with Aristotle's concept of hybridization and speciation. It is, as al-Jahid says, with universal authority granted the Stagirite's books without deploying the very empirical and dialectical methodology he promulgated. So that Aristotle's proposition about hybridity, with its illustrations of imaginary as well as existing creatures, were accepted without any of his testimony having ever been verified by any scientist. This touches on another more fundamental dispute, and that is with Aristotle's concept of generic hybridity in style. Rather, not with Aristotle's concept of generic hybridity, you come full circle, but his performance. The fundamental evolutionary diversity of life al-Jahid purports includes humanity and its institutions, which, as was the case for Plato, requires a style of narration as the articulation of thinking that is adequate to such diversity. Al-Jahid's Book of Living has a very important history here. He had belonged to the group of Aristotelian rationalists that, in their own right, had waged an inquisition against the Muslim fundamentals. And when his caliph was deposed by his son, that son forbid public rational disputation. Now, the importance of public rational disputation for the particular school of semioticians that al-Jahid belonged to, the Mu'tazilites, that act, that performance, is what sustained the order of the universe. So the banning of it publicly meant that it was at risk, was the possibility of maintaining the order of the universe. And so al-Jahid, to get around the ban, wanted to take that public practice of disputation and invent a style in writing that would continue the project of maintaining the order of the universe. And the very style of this book of living is a style in which all kinds of anecdotes and stories are sort of hammered together in a very eclectic way, with the narrative structure playing the role of an organizing intelligence a la God. This is where the issue of style is important. For al-Jahid, then, natural development means that a concept or idea moves from intention to completeness with a variety of external factors playing a key part. So that human cognition entails a complexity that cannot be reduced to the pure narration of deliberative reason expressed in the dialectic. This is why he thought that the Greek project of Poetics was weak and failed, as well as the Persians. They couldn't do it. There's no pure chain of causality and generation of knowledge. Another sort of style more aligned with the imagistic mode of mimicry is called for. The contrast between Plato's account of the philosophical dog and al-Jahid's al-Hakia is not only a distinction in descriptive, it is most of all a distinction in style of description. I want to close with this story. The Arabic narrative style of eloquence developed by al-Jahid aims at representing the dynamic interaction between perception and conceptualization in order to exhibit the pivotal and essential role the spontaneity of imagination plays in what and how humans are in the world. Elaborating the style as thinking in disorder is an attempt at pursuing a particular kind of poetic criticism as a model for a theory of community and love. I go to New York bi-weekly. And I go to the barrio of Washington Heights, which is becoming, since Sandy, very gentrified. So it's going from being a colored Dominican barrio to something else. And part of that gentrification has been an influx of Yemeni shopgoers, who are owning a whole series of gourmet delis and supermarkets that cater to the new gentrified class of, in large measure, Trustafarians and Colombian students with some kind of money. Now, there's a particular deli on 150A, which is where I reside, that I go to pretty regularly, and they know me. We talk. This is a Yemeni deli. And I come in one day, and one of the young men in the deli, who I have a regular conversation with, is holding forth with two policemen who are Puerto Ricans. They're Kenyans. And they're holding forth in the most current New York argot, which of course is black. Okay. And I come in and I say to him, my gosh, you speak English. What's with you, man? It sounds bad than you became just like an American. And there's a joke that he and I play. I always speak to this Yemeni in a Moroccan dialect. Okay. You speak like the Americans now. Shoo Sarbi. To which he says to me, "What's up, dog?" And my only response was, "Woof." Thank you. I apologize for because to really appreciate the scope of how it's an argument of Beauvais, you'd have to know the Yellow Dog Blues.
We have, we began a little bit late, but I think we can still steal time in the course of the day here and there, so we have time for questions.
A clear sign of my absolute incoherence. Oh, I thought I was going to get off easy.
I'm sure you will. This goes back actually to the beginning, and perhaps absent Yellow Dog, we're not going to be able to do it. But I wanted to ask about the distinction you were making between sacrifice and murder at the beginning. Just to ask, in my usage anyway, murder requires a judge, and it seems to me that so much of the history that you're referring to of Black people in the United States hinges on the absence of the judge. So that killing, yes, but murder, I don't know. So you know what you intend by the distinctions you're making, and my misfit in my understanding of the terms just is to offer you a chance to elucidate a little further.
Yes, part of the passage that I still can't pull up, but on the Yellow Dog Blues, has a nice segue into Of Becoming a John. This is the second chapter of the book I'm finishing. The first chapter is a long meditation on that, in which I mark how Baldwin's statement about this being about killing resonates, does not quote the passage in Of Becoming a John, when indeed the judge says to John Jones, in Jones's petition for the school, if you give them any bad ideas, we're going to kill you. We are those who kill niggers, right? Which is an expression, I agree, of the community based in the killing of niggers. Right? So the judge is present. It's an act of judgment. And of course, at the end of the story, as you know, well, you found it.
Of course.
I thought you found my talk. This is just keep it in case someone wants me to read it. At the end of the story, as you know, it's the judge who indeed passes the sentence that leads to Jones's death, as he as he recites Lohengrin going on. Right? So, indeed, the passage is to mark precisely how it's murder where the judge is present. Right? And then, of course, in the case of Rufus Scott, the function of the judge is internalized in the constitution of Rufus's own self, which is key in the conversation that he and Ferris have about precisely that. The whole passage about Amura, where Ferris sees an analogy between Rufus and his friend Amura. The critique is precisely of how the function of the law, which for Ferris becomes the state that emerges out of the revolutionary project, is the function of judgment that does the killing, and the killing that forecloses on the possibilities of what Ferris says expressly is called for, living life artistically, that is poetry. So yeah, you're right, but the judge is there. The judge is there. And indeed, I mean, in a longer passage, the whole issue of the dog and the white dog is an important figure here because it has to do with the ancient name of the cynics, right? And which becomes that school of those people who are mixed amongst, that don't belong in the poets, that generate an order of learning that violates the dictates of pedagogical mimesis, which I want to read and argue is at play there, both in Du Bois's depiction of the Negro in the scene of the killing, and then in Baldwin's taking it up with Rufus, and Ferris is taking it up. And then, of course, with Ferris, when he takes it up as a part of his express critique of the Durkheimian school of sociology, and a sort of return to Meyerson's notion of a theory of the social processes of individuation, right, which is another way of understanding that. Not simple the harmonization that Girard talks about, but the historical nature of the building themselves that are part of a communal process and don't presuppose a transcendental point of departure, a transcendental conception.
I would like to hear you speak a bit more about mimicry and sacrifice. One of the things that you seem to be saying about mimicry is that, of course, it's not simply, it's never ever simply surface. It's never ever simply just a superficial enactment, but rather it does something to the inside of the self. Now, one of the questions I have is about what happens to the, I'm thinking, of course, of Haitian sacrifice and the ways in which mimicry works within the ritual of possession. The self has to leave in order for the, let's say, wa to enter, and then the performance is of the presence, the embodiment of the wa. Now, in the barking dog, this barking, is it simply a mimesis that is a copy, or is there, in the Altahes, which I don't know, it's the book of the living, is there a question that the person who is barking has actually, something has changed inside, a certain kind of sacrifice of the old self to something else?
Yeah, the Book of the Living has come out in a wonderful translation in English, so you can read 2 volumes, rather expensive, usually put together. Neither. The Jahaz is clear, it's not copying. It's rejecting the pedagogical project. In the Book of Eloquence, he's quite clear when he says that the Arabic poetic form is spontaneous and not imitative in what it does. It excites, as Ibn Sina says, it excites the faculties of mind in a very specific way. But in exciting the faculties of mind, while it's not copying, it's also not about the transformation of an already integral self-consciousness that's becoming something else. So all of those ethnic groups, right? And this is why the Talmud is so important, the Khorassani, the Yemeni, etc., are constituted as selves in a very specific social dynamic where there is no grounds beyond that dynamic. Right? Which is why the mullah becomes such an important figure for him, because what it reveals is that any of the discourses of legitimacy, and here it's a kind of, he was an apologist for the Abbasids who were trying to argue for a sort of heterogeneous social structure against the Umayyad notion of essentialist identity. But at the same time, he was being critical as well of the Abbasid tendency as an imperial order towards. So any of the discourses of essential identity that create a hierarchical order, he's problematizing by showing, no, they're always about this open process, right? And that theories of speciation are a kind of sleight of hand. They're in question, right?
As inside, outside.
And there is no, this is why I'm disagreeing with Cleto, it's not inside, outside, right? But in fact, it's all, you know, what people like Sean Gallagher call extended mind, right? Which then is an account of a self that is grammatical. And I use that term very deliberately. It's a problem of translation I still have to work out because it has to do with a very specific notion of grammaticality and questions about the performance of pronouns in a sexual context in which there is no I without you. And both the I and the you are functions of a collective expression and not positions in relationship to actions. They're articulated in the action. And so what mimicry does, I'm arguing for him, is precisely perform that in a way that enables the constitution, it's poetic constitution of a collectivity. Which you know, Jahat calls it khayal is the term he uses, imaginative. But in the next generation, it will be called affective collectivity or aesthetic community to describe precisely the same thing. So, which is not to say there are no selves, but there are no souls. Right? Which, of course, is where this particular discourse begins to get into trouble. So you know, El-Ghazali will rightly accuse it of being, you know, on the verge of apostasy in his refutation of the philosophers. And then Ibn Rushd will refute Al-Ghazali's refutation in order to say that you need to have, again, this kind of dynamic structure, now in the context of Spain. And then, of course, Aquinas will embrace Ghazali's theory of this grammatical self in his famous treatise against liberalism. So, I think I've answered your question. No? No. I'm never certain I always answer the question. I did? Good. My inclination is to be evasive, yes.
Yes, could you go back about the origin of the term philosopher?
Yeah.
Didn't you mention that earlier?
Yeah.
I'm sorry that I missed the very beginning of the talk.
Yeah.
I was wondering how it enters Spanish, and from Spanish into all the other languages.
Yeah, well, you know, there is an etymology rather prevalent in the Arabic dictionaries, which is to say, it could be considered controversial, but the order of controversy is strong of power. The Arabic term is mula and also mulid, and it refers in the 8th, 9th, and 10th century, which is the process of Islamic expansion, to those elements of the conquered peoples who, because of their knowledge, in many cases, tend to be among the elite, are absorbed into the configuration of power. Now, in the early days of the expansion, after the death of Ali and his sons, and the ascendancy of the Umayyad structure, which is dynastic, that power structure was racial and tribal. So the access to legitimacy was to become affiliated to an Arabic tribe. And the mechanism of affiliation was the mechanism of the mulid, the mullah. So the mulid becomes, and it's usually translated as client of some tribe, right? But it also refers to that population as a result of the expansion through conquest of war that shares Arab blood, right? Which is usually paternalistically, right? Through conquest. And because it's through conquest of war, that's a euphemism for rape. Right? Mulk al-yamin, the property of the right hand. Right? Because it's through conquest of war, concubinage, the offspring of it are marked as being not quite purely Arab, although they are culturally and linguistically completely there. And historically, that becomes the element, both those who are not biologically brought in through rape, right, but are brought in through cultural affiliation, and those who are biologically brought in, that becomes the element that generates what we understand as contemporary Arabic literary and poetic culture. They function as the notaries, the intelligentsia, and indeed create their own forms of entertainment, which become the norm, they become the cosmopolitan. Now, because of issues of dialect, right, when the Umayyads moved to Spain and the Berber elements of the Spanish conquest, the African elements of the Spanish conquest, and the nature of the Arabic that's spoken in Spain, the Andalusian Arabic, Mulid becomes mulatto. And mulatto is the etymological origin of the Spanish mulatto, right? Carrying the same semantic range. Right? This is the important point, that it carries the same meaning, the same force, the same range of meanings. Which, of course, the point there is in a conversation between Ferris and Baldwin, the way in which Ferris and Baldwin, where Ferris wants to read this notion of mulattoes, mestizaje, as what America is. How to imagine a society of differentiation as the basis of community. But I can tell that we don't have time.
I was going to say, if it's okay with you, we can return in 10 minutes. But please thank Ronald Judy.